You're still awake, right? Good. The day has just started. My name is Chris Noring. I'm going to be your MC for the upcoming 3 talks. I'll also deliver the keynote tomorrow. But first off, I want to again thank Tracy for that awesome inspirational talk. So can we give Tracy another round of applause? All right. Our next speaker has come all the way from Belgium to deliver a talk on Angular Universal. Sam Vloeberghs here. He is the co-founder or organizer of NGBE, but also runs the Angular meetup in Belgium. So I'm going to hand this one over to Sam, and Angular Universal and SEO. That's going to be an exciting one, all right?
All right. Thank you for the introduction.
Thank you, Sam.
So thank you all for being here in the weekend. So it's very appreciated that you come in your free time to watch my talk. Today I'm going to talk about better SEO and social sharing, sharing on social media platforms with Angular Universal. So the things we're going to learn, or perhaps recap today, we're going to talk about the goal of Angular Universal, why and when not to use or implement Universal, how to use it to optimize for search engine optimization, social sharing, and user experience. And we're going to talk a little bit about how dependency helps us with that. Dependency injection helps us with that. But first, who am I? I am a freelance web developer for over more than 10 years. And that's what I do. I build websites, I build web applications. But I is not me. Me is we, and we became 3 over 9 months ago. So this is my girlfriend and my son. I'm also the organizer of NGBE, the yearly Angular conference in Belgium. And this year we are organizing our 4th edition. So, the big question, what is the goal of Angular Universal? The goal is to run Angular anywhere and framework agnostic. What does that mean exactly? Angular anywhere means you can run it in the browser, which is the typical case. You can run it on the server, which is a more advanced case, the case that we're going to talk about today. Or run it in a worker. But a worker is perhaps a little bit of an expert case, because I haven't seen any useful case where I would run Angular in the worker yet. But if anybody of you knows when to run Angular in a worker, please talk to me later. I'm happy to share some ideas. So the question to ask yourself is, would it make sense to do it? Framework agnostic means you can run it on a JavaScript platform, for example, using Express, the Happy engine, even these days Nest.js. And there's also an ASP.NET implementation available. If you are running a different server-side framework like PHP or Python or whatever, there is a generic solution available. I went too fast. So, the generic solution, when you have no native framework support available, is to use the socket engine. Socket engine is available in Universal to support any language via a JavaScript detour. The only thing that you need to make sure is that your framework, your server-side framework, is supporting TCP connections, so you can connect to the socket engine. So, the ultimate goal of Universal, in our case, is the ability to retrieve a stable and static state of our application, pre-render that stable state of our application to static HTML at runtime, on any platform, at runtime or at build time. The main idea is that we hold on to the thought of retrieving a stable state of our application. There are some questions to ask yourself, and the first one is, Angular Universal the right tool for the job? Whenever you are starting a new project, you will always have to make some decisions on technology that you choose. 2 questions to ask yourself. Is your team skilled in Angular? Yes. And do you have strong SEO requirements? If not, there's perhaps no real added value using Universal. but there are some valid use cases which I will explain later. Is your team skilled in Angular and you do have strong search engine optimization requirements? Consider using a different server-side framework because Angular Universal is a little bit still a new player on the scene. So there are more known and more tested frameworks available to do server-side rendering. But then again, is your team skilled in Angular and do you have strong search engine optimization requirements? Go for it. Use Angular and add some universal sugar to do server-side rendering of your Angular application. Then a second question, do you really need it? Why and when should you not use universal, or when should you use universal? There are some questions to ask yourself. Who is my user? Is it a potential customer of your web shop, or perhaps an employee in an enterprise application? What kind of website is it? Is it an informative website or a high-performance web shop? Perhaps a big administrative CRUD application? Is it an internal application? Is it living behind a firewall protected with user-specific credentials? Or is it a public-facing website? The most important question forms around these previous questions. Would your application really benefit from Angular Universal, and why? There are a few basic rules I always consider. Do use Universal if you have a public-facing website or an informative site or application when you need search engine optimization. If you need fast loading or fast time to interactive or a quick first contentful paint. For example, a blog, personal website, an informative company website, product pages of a web shop. You should not use Universal when you have a pure CRUD application, when it's behind the authentication mechanism or an internal application. Some examples are a back office of that same web shop I mentioned before, an enterprise application, or perhaps a mobile application or a progressive web app. But you can still use Universal, for example, in a progressive web app or a mobile application if you want fast renders. And why should you not use Universal? Of course, it adds complexity to your application. If you don't need it, why should you add it? What are some complex things about Universal? The first one is that not all of your dependencies are available on all the platforms. For example, the window, the navigator and the document global objects, and the cookies and the storage APIs. They're not available on the server. They're not available, some of them are not available in the worker or service worker. So you always have to check the platform you are running your Angular application on. How does that work? A basic example. You just have a service, you want to do some stuff, you check if you're on the browser, you do things that work in the browser, and in the other case, you do things that work on the server. Just to keep a basic example of browser versus server. You can use the platform ID of Angular and the is-platform browser or is-platform server, or perhaps in the expert case, the is-platform worker functions. A more typical example is a cookie service. If you want to read out a cookie on the browser, you can just use some ngx cookies library that you installed via npm, or you implement your own reading out cookies. But this is only available in the browser. So you use this cookie service in the browser, and on the server, you use the request, for example, from Express, to get the cookie out of the request. Another complex thing about Universal is that if you're doing server-side rendering and you're loading dynamic data, you could be reloading the dynamic data as soon as your application hits the browser. So when you're pre-rendering on your server with dynamic data, you want to serialize that data and transfer the state to the browser. Then you can use that serialized cache, that serialized data as a cache-first mechanism when you bootstrap the application. Just to give a quick example using some nice views. So the first thing that we do is we request a dynamic page, for example, a news detail page. We server-side render this page with our dynamic data coming from the database. And we return the full HTML and JavaScript and CSS and all other static assets that form our Angular application to the browser. The browser sees this initial content, HTML, and shows the user the page. Then the browser sees, this is an Angular application. So the browser bootstraps the Angular application. But then it sees, this is a dynamic page. It's the detailed news page. So I'll fetch the data again. And you rebuild that page from data that comes from the server. So you're doing a round trip to the server that is not required. So how can we avoid this extra round trip to the server? We do the same thing. We request a dynamic page. We server-side render the page. But now we serialize the data and we return it together with our request. Our browser again sees that this is a Angular application, so it bootstraps, but instead of going to the server, it now uses the serialized data that was returned with the request. So there's no extra round trip again to the server. So remember what I told about the stable state of your application? I would say that it is really as complex as this. Wow, it's amazing. So remember that we talked about the stable state of your application. What does that really mean? When is your application stable? Your application being stable means it's able to render, but you have a lot of async and reactive code. And if you're coming back from AngularJS, I was implementing AngularJS some years ago. There was this digest loop, which basically meant that you could have no real way of knowing that your application was stable. But thank God for the new Angular that we now know when our application is stable. Your application is stable when the zone basically is stable. When you have no micro or macro task spanning, like a set timeout or an unresolved promise or an observable which is not complete. And for this, we have a very handy observable, which is exposed on the application ref, which you can inject in your application. And when this observable emits, you know that your application is stable. So you have programmed your application, and you release it out into the wild. And then the SEO expert comes to you and he says, no, this is not good. This is not good. So how can Universal help with your search engine optimization and social sharing? There are different ways to optimize for search engine optimization and social sharing. First, the most important one is the initial content of your application, which is, of course, the main food for crawlers of Google, Bing, and any other social networks, search engines. But just to be fair, I also consider social platforms to be search engines or crawlers because they also crawl your website and they also index your pages. Then another thing is the usage of correct meta, title, alternate, and other tags, and JSON-LD data or microdata. I will go through all of them. So if some of them are not very clear, perhaps JSON-LD data, I will explain later. So first of all, the initial content. The initial content means the full HTML of your application, of your page. This data, this HTML, contains all the vital information that the first crawl by search engines index when they visit your website. It's also good for users because your users do not have to wait for the content. They do not have to wait for your Angular application to bootstrap. They will immediately see what's on the page. That basically means that you go from code or source code that is delivered from the server like this, which is used for client-side rendering, to this, which is done by server-side rendering. You just return more code and you return the full content of your application. Then the next thing is the correct usage of meta and outer tags. And then you need to be very careful because, like I mentioned before, I do not consider Google, Bing, Yahoo, whatever, to be the only search engines out there. I also consider social networks. And you have to know that they all behave very differently. For example, Facebook and LinkedIn, they use the Open Graph prefix in a meta tag. And they use, for example, for the title, they use OG title, and they use the property attribute on the meta tag. Twitter uses a Twitter prefix. It uses Twitter title and the name attribute of a meta tag. And then Google does who knows what, but it's very important to know that apparently the meta description tag is important. So for setting the title on your page for Twitter, for Facebook, for LinkedIn, for example, you need to run this code. You need to inject the meta service and the title service, which are provided to you by Angular, into your service. And as soon as you know the title of your page, you can set it. The title service will set the title which you see in the browser, and the meta service will inject meta tags correctly based on your requirements. And of course, you clean up the meta tags if there are no given. Thankfully, we have a lot of tools. The main social networks provide tools for us to validate our pages. For example, for Twitter, you have the card validator, you have the crawler debugger for Facebook, you have the post inspector for LinkedIn, and for Google, you can use the search console or the structured data tool. Then, a very important one that I learned the hard way, is that you need to be careful for over-optimizing your initial content. For example, when you deliver source, HTML source to the browser from the server, it's a good thing to minify that HTML. You want to strip out all unnecessary bloat, spaces, new lines, whatever that you don't need, you want to strip it all out. So the example from HTML minification is an important one because, again, not all search engines or crawlers are equally capable of parsing or executing your HTML and JavaScript. What does this mean? If you over-optimize, you get something like this. Keep in mind that in this case, we're already server-side rendering, so we're already returning our code, our full HTML to the browser, to the user, but it's over-optimized, and we get something like this. This is not good. We're missing a picture, we're missing a description, we're not using the correct title, for example. LinkedIn is guessing what it needs to show. And why is that? Because this code is over-optimized. And I will give you a minute to find out what is missing. So I can drink a little bit. It is over-optimized because of using too much HTML minify options. And basically, we are removing attribute quotes and optional tags, which is fine in some cases if your browser is handling the source code, because your browser, Chrome, Firefox, is very capable of fixing those errors for you. But if you have LinkedIn, for example, which is just a bot crawling your page and parsing your HTML, top-down in a tree, for example, then you should not remove all optional tags. Can you see what's added now? It's the head tag. Head tag is missing, was missing, and now it's returned. Because the head tag is an optional tag in HTML. And if you keep it, LinkedIn is able to do this. I learned this the hard way. Spent very much time on this. So, how does dependency injection help? Dependency injection allows us to inject the right services depending on the platform. So if we're running our application on the server or in the browser, it allows us to use the same API and do no platform check while we're coding. We can just inject the same service using the same API and don't care about the platform that we're building for. As an example, I will show JSON-LD data. What is JSON-LD data? It's a network of standard-based machine-readable data. That's a lot, but if you will see an example, you will immediately see what I mean. It's used across websites, and it's also used to link between websites. And it's a very structured alternative to microdata. Plus, it's very good for search engine optimization. This is a very basic example of JSON-LD data, and this is what is currently on the homepage of my own website. We use the context to define the library that defines the types of objects that we're using, and we're adding data that is associated with the defined object that we put in the type. Very good examples of this are, for example, adding a frequently asked questions section on the Google result page, or, for example, adding reviews and pricing on the results of Google search. So we want to render our JSON-LD data, but the only relevant place to render your JSON-LD data is on the server. Why? Because search engines are not navigating client-side on your applications. If they visit a new page, they will just fetch the new page. They will not click on the element to click on a link to go to a new page. So we want to use the services that we provide, but we don't want to check while we're coding that we don't want to check which platform we're coding for. So now, again, the isTable observable comes in very handy. There are extra hooks in the isTable implementation. They are called before app serialized, and I will show you later how you can use those. First of all, I need to go to very basically through the difference between a browser implementation and a server implementation. Basically, for our browser, we have just the app module, where we import all of our modules. We import, for example, a module that I've written myself, the browser JSON-LD data module. And then we implement the server module, where we import that same app module, but now we also import the server JSON-LD data module. And what you should just remember now is that the app server module is basically an extension and an override of the app module. There's more to it, but that's the main idea. Qua implementation, the browser JSON-LD module is just a module that provides the JSON-LD service. And the server JSON-LD module is the same browser JSON-LD module, but enhanced with extra code that will hook into the before app serialized, like this, provide a function factory that gets executed before app serialized. That means that as soon as our application gets an emit on the isObservable, the isTable observable, there are extra hooks checking are there callback functions that need to be executed before we render the application. And that's what we're doing here. As soon as our application is stable, we are executing the serialized JSON-LD factory function. And what that does is just take the JSON data, stringify it to JSON, and then inject it in the head tag. That's all that's happening. And in the end, we get something like this. We get all the meta tags injected, we get the JSON-LD injected in the page, and of course all of your content which is available in your application. You don't have to write this yourself. You can, for learning purposes perhaps, or you can take a peek at NGX SEO to see how it's implemented. But you don't have to do the work yourself. You can just use this tool if you want to. Now, I would say, wasn't that easy? Well, if you are doing it a lot, it's easy, but take your time to investigate this if you have strong SEO requirements, because it's very hard to get it right. So, the conclusion. Let's summarize what we have discussed today. The goal of Universal is to run Angular everywhere, on the server, in the browser, or perhaps a worker in the browser. You can run Angular Universal on any server you'd like, as long as you can start the node process, and your server framework is capable of handling TCP connections, because that's the way your framework will be connecting to the node process. The rendered version on the server is based on the stable state of your application, meaning that Angular is capable of detecting when your application should be rendered. Next of all, there are different ways to optimize for search engine optimization and social sharing. First one, Angular Universal gives you fast and meaningful initial content. You can generate valid meta tags that allow for social media platforms like Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and others to render previews of your page based on the URL of your pages. And you can use JSON-LD or JSON-linked data that allows you to output structured data for search engines to give more detailed context to your pages. And very important, all search engines and social media platforms provide you with tools to validate your implementations. You can use dependency injection to do different things on different platforms, for example, on the server, on the browser, or in a worker. And you can keep using the same API, but change the functionality under the hood, depending on the platform. Thank you for your attention. If you have any questions afterwards, feel free to come and find me and ask your questions. And thank you for attending my talk.